The German spotter pressed his eye against the scope, scanning the rubble-strewn street for the third time that morning. His partner lay dead beside him, a single bullet through the temple. No muzzle flash, no sound, just death, arriving like a winter ghost. Somewhere in that frozen wasteland of Leningrad, a Soviet sniper was hunting them, and nobody could find him. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to make every breath visible as a betraying cloud of steam. Yet this phantom shooter left no trace, no vapor, nothing. How was it possible? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Vasily Korotayev had been a hunter long before the war came to his village. In the forests of Karelia, he had learned patience from his grandfather, a man who could sit motionless for hours waiting for elk to pass within range. Those skills seemed almost quaint now, relics of a simpler time when the only thing at stake was whether the family would have meat for winter. Now, in January of 1943, Vasily found himself using those same skills to hunt men through the bombed-out ruins of Leningrad, a city that had become a frozen tomb for hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants. The siege had begun in September of 1941, when German forces encircled the city, cutting off supply routes and condemning its population to a slow death by starvation and cold. By the time Vasily arrived with a fresh battalion of Red Army troops in late 1942, the streets were filled with corpses that the survivors lacked the strength to bury. The dead froze where they fell, becoming landmarks that soldiers used to navigate the shattered cityscape. Children no longer cried, too weak from hunger to waste the energy. The living moved like shadows, their faces hollow, their eyes empty of everything except the desperate will to see another sunrise. Vasily had volunteered for sniper training after watching a German machine gun nest massacre an entire company during a failed assault on a factory district. He had been pinned down behind an overturned tram for 6 hours, listening to the screams of wounded men freezing to death in no man's land. When darkness finally fell and he crawled back to Soviet lines, something had changed inside him. The anger he felt was cold and calculated. Nothing like the hot rage he had known before. He wanted to kill Germans, yes, but more than that, he wanted to make them afraid. He wanted them to feel hunted. The training had been brief but intensive. A grizzled instructor named Borodin, who claimed over 100 kills, taught Vasily and 9 other candidates the fundamentals of long-range shooting. Most of it Vasily already knew from his hunting days, but Borodin added crucial elements about reading wind, calculating distance in urban environments, and choosing positions that offered both concealment and escape routes. The Mosin-Nagant rifle became an extension of Vasily's body during those 3 weeks of training. He learned its quirks, the slight pull to the left at ranges over 300 meters, the way cold affected the bolt mechanism, the importance of keeping the scope clean and fog-free. 8 of the 10 trainees graduated. 1 had been killed during a training exercise that turned real when German artillery found their practice range. Another washed out after losing his nerve during his first combat stalk. Vasily passed with the highest marks, and Borodin pulled him aside on the last day with advice that would save his life many times over. "Trust your instincts," the old sniper said. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. Never take the same route twice. Never use the same hide more than once. And most importantly, stay invisible. The moment they know where you are already dead." Vasily's first kill came on a gray December morning during his 3rd day in Leningrad. He had positioned himself in the upper floor of a destroyed apartment building, wedged into a corner where fallen beams created a natural hide. Through his scope, he watched a German officer step out of a reinforced bunker to light a cigarette. The man stood there arrogantly, as if daring the Soviets to take a shot. Vasily steadied his breathing, placed the crosshairs just below the officer's collar, and squeezed the trigger. The Mosin-Nagant kicked against his shoulder, the report echoing across the frozen streets. The German dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Vasily felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, just a cold acknowledgement that he had done what needed doing. He packed up and moved to a new position before enemy spotters could triangulate his location. The kills accumulated quickly after that. German soldiers, careless after months of siege warfare, made themselves easy targets. They clustered around fires for warmth, stood in doorways smoking, walked the same patrol routes at the same times every day. Vasily studied their patterns like a scientist studying insects, noting every habit and routine. He kept a small notebook where he sketched maps of German positions, marking the times when sentries changed, when officers made their rounds, when supply trucks arrived. This information he shared with his commanders, but he kept his hunting grounds to himself. Other snipers operated in Leningrad, some of them famous throughout the Red Army, but Vasily preferred to work alone. Partners meant conversation, and conversation meant distraction, and distraction meant death. By early January of 1943, Vasily had accumulated 43 confirmed kills. His superiors were pleased, but he knew the number meant little. For every German soldier he killed, 3 more took his place. The siege continued with no end in sight. The real value of his work, he believed, was psychological. German soldiers grew nervous, jumped at shadows, spent more time watching for snipers than fighting. Fear was a weapon as potent as any bullet. The problem that nearly killed Vasily revealed itself during an especially cold snap in mid-January. The temperature plummeted to minus 35 degrees, so cold that metal burned exposed skin on contact. Vasily had taken up a position in a collapsed bakery, using shattered ovens for cover, while he sighted on a German observation post across a wide street. He had been waiting for 2 hours, barely moving, his body so numb from cold that he could no longer feel his toes. When the German observer finally appeared in the window, Vasily prepared to take the shot. He steadied his breathing, found his sight picture, began the slow squeeze on the trigger. Then he saw it. A cloud of steam from his own breath had condensed in the frigid air, hanging in front of his position like a signal flare. In the seconds before he could pull back into cover, a German bullet cracked past his head. So close he felt the supersonic wave against his cheek. Bits of brick exploded next to his face. Vasily rolled backward, abandoning his rifle momentarily as more shots peppered his position. He had been spotted, not because of movement or poor concealment, but because his own breath had betrayed him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Every sniper in this frozen hell faced the same problem. In these temperatures, breathing meant creating visible vapor that pointed like an arrow to your position. No wonder German snipers seemed to know exactly where Soviet shooters hid. The cold itself was the enemy's ally. Vasily escaped that day by crawling through the bakery's collapsed basement and emerging 2 buildings away. He retrieved his rifle under cover of darkness, angry at himself for the mistake. That night, huddled in a dugout shelter with a dozen other soldiers, he couldn't stop thinking about the problem. How could a sniper remain invisible when every breath announced his presence? He watched the other men in the shelter, noting how some breathed into their collars, how others cupped their hands over their mouths. Neither technique would work for a sniper who needed his hands on his rifle and his face pressed against a scope. The solution came to him 3 days later, while watching a veteran infantryman prepare for sentry duty. The soldier wrapped a thick wool scarf around his face, covering his nose and mouth, leaving only his eyes exposed. The scarf, the soldier explained, served double duty. It protected against frostbite, and it trapped the moisture from his breath, preventing the telltale steam clouds that could draw sniper fire. Vasily stared at the man as understanding dawned. The principle was simple. If he could trap and disperse his breath through fabric, the vapor would dissipate before it became visible. The scarf would act as a filter, warming the air and spreading the moisture over a larger area where it would blend with the ambient atmosphere. He tested the theory the next morning, wrapping his own scarf around his face before heading out to hunt. The fabric, a gift from his sister before he deployed, was thick wool that his mother had woven years ago. It smelled of wood smoke and home, a scent that seemed impossibly distant now. Vasily positioned himself in a bombed-out church, the collapsed dome providing excellent cover and clear sight lines to 3 German positions. He settled in, pressing his eye to the scope, and began his breathing routine. Slow inhale through the nose, hold for 3 seconds. Slow exhale through the mouth into the scarf. The wool absorbed the moisture from his breath, and when he glanced at the space in front of his position, he saw nothing. No vapor, no steam, no betraying cloud to mark his location. The German soldier who walked into Vasily's sights 15 minutes later never knew what hit him. The man had been standing guard outside a machine gun nest, stomping his feet and blowing on his hands. Vasily's bullet took him in the chest, and the man fell without a sound. Vasily worked the bolt smoothly, chambering another round, his breath still hidden behind the scarf. He waited. Other Germans emerged from the nest, looking around frantically, trying to spot the shooter. One of them made the fatal mistake of standing still too long while scanning the Soviet lines. Vasily's second shot was as clean as the first. Now, the Germans were panicking, firing blindly at suspected sniper positions. Vasily remained motionless, watching through his scope as they wasted ammunition on empty buildings. They had no idea where he was. Over the following weeks, Vasily refined his technique. He learned that the scarf needed to be damp to work best, as dry fabric sometimes allowed small puffs of vapor to escape. Each morning before heading out, he would dip the scarf in water and let it freeze slightly, creating a barrier that trapped moisture more effectively. He also discovered that breathing through his nose worked better than mouth breathing, as the nasal passages warmed the air more efficiently before it hit the scarf. These small adjustments made him nearly invisible in the frozen landscape of Leningrad. While other snipers struggled with the cold, their positions given away by breath vapor or scope glare, or the simple misfortune of choosing the wrong hiding spot, Vasily seemed to vanish into the ruins like a ghost. His kill count climbed steadily. 50, 60, 75. The Germans began offering rewards for information about the sniper, who seemed to strike from nowhere. They called him the Winter Phantom, a name that Vasily found grimly amusing. Let them think he was supernatural. Fear was its own kind of weapon. Soviet command took notice as well. Vasily was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Order of the Red Star. They wanted to use him for propaganda, to parade him before newsreel cameras and journalists. Vasily refused politely but firmly. The moment his face became known, he reasoned, his effectiveness would end. Anonymity was survival. Not all of his hunts ended in kills. Some days he would spend hours in position without firing a single shot, either because no targets presented themselves or because the tactical situation made shooting too risky. Vasily learned to be patient, to recognize when waiting was wiser than acting. He remembered his grandfather's words about elk hunting. "Sometimes you come home empty-handed," the old man had said. "That is the way of the hunter. You cannot force nature to give you what you want. You can only prepare yourself to take advantage when opportunity appears." Those words served Vasily well in the ruins of Leningrad. He never forced a shot, never took unnecessary risks, never let impatience override judgment. There were close calls. Once, a German patrol stumbled across one of his hiding positions while he was still occupying it. Vasily had burrowed into a pile of rubble in a collapsed school, using the bodies of dead children as additional concealment, a necessity that haunted his dreams. When the German soldiers began picking through the rubble, searching for salvageable materials, Vasily pressed himself flat against the frozen ground, his scarf wrapped tight around his face, breathing so slowly that he felt lightheaded. A German corporal stood less than 2 meters away, so close that Vasily could have reached out and touched his boot. The soldier never looked down. After an eternity that lasted perhaps 5 minutes, the patrol moved on. Vasily waited another hour before extracting himself from the position, his body shaking not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash of near discovery. Another time, a German sniper nearly got him. Vasily had been stalking a high-value target, a colonel who made regular inspections of frontline positions. He had tracked the man for 3 days, learning his schedule and routes. When the colonel finally stepped into a kill zone, Vasily was ready, but so was someone else. As Vasily squeezed the trigger, he caught a glint of reflected light from a building to his left. Instinct made him flinch to the side a split second before a German bullet smashed into the wall where his head had been. Both shots fired simultaneously, the reports overlapping into a single crack that echoed across the frozen city. Vasily's bullet missed the colonel by centimeters. The German sniper's bullet missed Vasily by even less. Both shooters immediately abandoned their positions, knowing that staying meant death. Vasily later learned from scouts that the German colonel had been so shaken by the near miss that he refused to leave his bunker for a week. As for the German sniper who had nearly killed him, Vasily never saw him again. Perhaps the man had been transferred, or perhaps he had fallen victim to another Soviet shooter. The anonymity of sniper warfare meant you often never knew the fate of your enemies or your rivals. The technique with the scarf became Vasily's signature, though few people knew about it. He mentioned it once to a junior sniper who had been complaining about the cold betraying his position. The young man, barely 19 years old with soft hands that marked him as a city boy, had listened with wide eyes as Vasily explained the method. The next day, that same young sniper killed his first German using the breathing technique. Within a week, he had 3 more kills. Within 2 weeks, he was dead, caught by a German counter-sniper who had better patience. Vasily felt a pang of guilt when he heard the news, wondering if he should have kept his methods secret, but he pushed the feeling aside. This was war. Everyone had the same chance of dying, regardless of technique or skill. The only difference was that some people could delay death a little longer than others. By February of 1943, Vasily's official tally stood at 137 confirmed kills. Unofficially, the number was likely higher, as many shots taken at long range or in confused combat situations went unconfirmed. His commanders wanted to publicize his achievements, to boost morale among both soldiers and civilians. Vasily agreed reluctantly to a single interview with a Red Army newspaper correspondent, providing that his photograph would not be published and that certain operational details would remain classified. The resulting article painted him as a heroic defender of the motherland, a simple hunter who had turned his skills against the fascist invaders. The truth was more complicated. Vasily did not feel heroic. He felt tired. The cold had seeped into his bones, becoming a permanent ache that no amount of warmth could cure. He had killed so many men that their faces blurred together in his memory. Sometimes he dreamed of them, but in his dreams, they were elk standing in snowy forests. And when he shot them, they transformed into German soldiers as they fell. The siege of Leningrad ground on through the winter. Soviet forces launched repeated attempts to break through the German lines, attacks that cost thousands of lives for minimal gains. Vasily continued his work, moving through the ruins like a specter, his scarf wrapped around his face, his breath invisible in the frozen air. He expanded his hunting grounds, venturing deeper into German-controlled territory, taking risks that would have seemed insane to anyone who understood the odds. But Vasily had long since stopped calculating odds. He operated on instinct now, trusting the animal awareness that told him when to shoot and when to hold fire, when to advance and when to retreat. One of his most audacious kills came in late February when he infiltrated a German headquarters building to eliminate a general who had been coordinating artillery strikes against civilian areas. The building was heavily guarded, surrounded by minefields and wire obstacles. Vasily spent 4 days observing the defenses, mapping patrol schedules, identifying weak points. On the 5th day, during a heavy snowstorm that reduced visibility to a few meters, he slipped through the perimeter, dressed in a white camouflage suit he had fashioned from bed sheets. He moved between sentry positions during shift changes, timing his advances with the precision of a clockmaker. Inside the building, he climbed to the 3rd floor and found a storage closet that overlooked the general's office. He waited there for 16 hours, wedged between boxes of German rations, his scarf damp with frozen breath, his body temperature dropping to dangerous levels. When the general finally appeared, standing at his window, reviewing papers in the afternoon light, Vasily took the shot from less than 50 meters away. The glass shattered and the general dropped. Alarms sounded immediately. Vasily had planned for this. He had already identified his escape route, a damaged stairwell that led to the basement where a collapsed wall provided access to the sewers. He moved fast, abandoning stealth for speed, knowing that the Germans would seal the building within minutes. Bullets chased him down the stairs as sentries converged on his last position. He dove through the hole in the basement wall just as a grenade exploded behind him, the blast wave shoving him forward into the sewage-filled darkness. He crawled through the filth for over an hour, following the tunnel system that led back towards Soviet lines. When he finally emerged, covered in frozen waste and shaking from hypothermia, a pair of Red Army soldiers nearly shot him before recognizing his uniform. The medics who treated him said he had been less than an hour away from death by exposure. Vasily did not tell them about the general. That information went only to his commander, who confirmed the kill 2 days later through intelligence reports. The cost of such operations was cumulative. Vasily's body began to break down under the constant stress and exposure. He developed a persistent cough that the medics said might be early-stage pneumonia. His hands, which had once been steady as stone, now trembled slightly when he was not actively focused on a task. His feet suffered from repeated frostbite, the toes blackened and painful. Sleep became difficult, haunted by dreams of frozen faces and the crack of rifle fire. Food held no appeal. though he forced himself to eat the meager rations the army provided. He lost weight, his already lean frame becoming skeletal. Yet he continued. Every morning he wrapped the scarf around his face, picked up his Mosin-Nagant, and ventured into the frozen maze of Leningrad. The scarf had become almost a talisman for him, a piece of home that connected him to the person he had been before the war. His sister had written him one letter that managed to get through before the siege fully tightened. In it, she mentioned the scarf, asking if he still had it, and if it was keeping him warm. Vasily had written back, though he doubted the letter would ever reach her, describing how the scarf had saved his life more times than he could count. He did not tell her that it smelled of death now, that the wool held the copper tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Some truths were too heavy to share. In March of 1943, the Red Army finally broke through the German lines in a massive offensive. Supply convoys began reaching Leningrad, bringing food and ammunition and hope. The worst of the siege was over, though fighting would continue for another year before the Germans were fully driven back. Vasily's unit was rotated off the front lines for rest and refit. He spent 2 weeks in a hospital being treated for malnutrition, frostbite, and respiratory problems. The doctors wanted to send him home, declaring him unfit for further combat duty. Vasily refused. Where would he go? His village had been destroyed in the early months of the war. His family was scattered or dead. He had no way of knowing which. The army was his home now. The rifle was his purpose. His commanders, recognizing both his value and his deteriorated condition, assigned him to a training unit. He would teach new snipers the skills that had kept him alive for over a year in the frozen hell of Leningrad. Vasily accepted the assignment with mixed feelings. Part of him was relieved to step back from frontline duty. Another part felt like he was abandoning his post. But orders were orders, and besides, he told himself, training the next generation of snipers was a way to multiply his effectiveness. One hunter could only kill so many elk, but a hunter who taught others could impact an entire forest. The training facility was located 50 kilometers behind the lines in a town that had been largely spared from the fighting. Vasily found the relative quiet unsettling at first. He had grown so accustomed to the constant background noise of artillery and small arms fire that silence felt wrong, like a held breath waiting to exhale. The trainees were a mix of volunteers and draftees, some as young as 17, others in their 40s. Vasily taught them everything Borodin had taught him, and everything he had learned through hard experience in Leningrad. He emphasized patience above all else. Shooting, he told them, was the easy part. Any fool could pull a trigger. The art of sniping lay in becoming invisible, in reading terrain and weather and human behavior, in knowing when not to shoot. He devoted an entire class to the breathing technique that had saved him so many times. He demonstrated with his own scarf, now threadbare and stained, showing the trainees how to wrap it, how to breathe through it, how to keep the fabric damp in freezing conditions. Some of the students seemed skeptical, unable to believe that such a simple trick could make a difference. Vasily did not argue with them. He simply took them outside on a cold morning and had them observe each other with and without the scarf technique. The difference was obvious. The skeptics became believers. How many lives did this save? Vasily had no way of knowing, but he hoped the number was large. His official kill count ended at 217, confirmed, plus dozens more that were probable but unverified. By any measure, he was one of the most successful snipers in the Red Army. Awards and commendations arrived, which he accepted with the same detached gratitude he showed for his daily rations. What mattered to Vasily was not the recognition, but the fact that he had survived. Against all odds and all logic, he had lived when so many others had died. His grandfather would have called it hunter's luck, that indefinable quality that allowed some men to walk unscathed through danger, while others fell at the first sign of trouble. The war continued. Vasily trained students through the spring and summer of 1943, watching waves of young men pass through his classes before heading to various fronts. Some returned for advanced training, others he never saw again. He tried not to think about their fates, tried not to calculate what percentage of them would survive to see the war's end. Teaching required a certain emotional distance. If he allowed himself to care too much about each individual student, the weight of their potential deaths would crush him. In September of 1943, nearly 2 years after the siege of Leningrad began, the city was finally liberated completely. Soviet forces drove the Germans back, reclaiming the territory that had been contested for so long. Vasily requested permission to return to Leningrad, wanting to see the city without the constant threat of enemy fire. His request was granted, and he spent 3 days walking through neighborhoods he had once hunted in. The destruction was even worse than he remembered. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble. The bodies had been cleared away, but their ghosts remained. Vasily walked past the bakery where German bullets had nearly killed him, past the church where he had perfected his breathing technique, past the school where he had hidden among dead children. Each location held memories, most of them dark. He found himself standing in front of the building where he had killed the German general, looking up at the shattered window. A new general had taken that man's place, and then another, and the war had ground on regardless. What had any of it accomplished? On his last day in Leningrad, Vasily visited a cemetery where many of the siege victims had been buried in mass graves. Thousands upon thousands of names were carved into memorial stones. He stood there for a long time, reading names at random, thinking about the people they represented. Old people who had starved, children who had frozen, soldiers who had fallen defending the city. Each name was a story, a life interrupted. Vasily thought about the Germans he had killed, wondered if they had families who mourned them, wondered if their names were carved on stones in distant cemeteries. Probably. Death was the one currency that bought the same thing for everyone, regardless of which side they fought on. He unwrapped his scarf, holding it in his hands, studying the worn wool and the dark stains that would never wash out. This piece of fabric had been his salvation, his secret weapon, his connection to home. In his hands it looked like nothing special, just an old scarf that had seen hard use. But Vasily knew better. This scarf represented the difference between visibility and invisibility, between life and death. It was, in its own way, a tool as important as his rifle. More important, perhaps, because a rifle could be replaced, but the knowledge of how to become invisible was something that came only through experience and innovation. Vasily returned to his training duties with renewed purpose. The war would continue, probably for years yet. The Germans were being pushed back on all fronts, but they fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat was coming and hoped to delay it as long as possible. More snipers would be needed, more hunters trained to stalk human prey through the ruins of civilization. Vasily could provide that training. He could pass on the techniques that had kept him alive, the scarf trick, the patience, the instinct, the cold mathematics of effective killing. It was not the legacy he would have chosen in another life, but it was the one this life had given him. The students continued to come. Vasily continued to teach. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall. The seasons cycled and the war ground on, and men died and Vasily remained, a ghost who had somehow managed to become solid again. His cough never fully went away. His hands still trembled when he was tired. His feet ached constantly from the frostbite damage. These were the prices he had paid for survival, and he considered them reasonable. Others had paid much more. In November of 1944, 3 years after the siege began, Vasily received word that his sister had been found alive in a refugee camp. She had survived the German occupation of their region and was asking about him. The Red Army arranged for them to meet during his next leave. When Vasily saw her, thin and worn but alive, he felt something crack inside his chest. They held each other without speaking, and Vasily realized he was crying for the first time since the war began. His sister touched his face, wiping away the tears, and asked if he still had the scarf she had given him. Vasily nodded, unable to speak. She smiled then, a fragile expression that reminded him of their mother. "Good," she said. "I knitted protection into every thread. It was supposed to keep you safe." Vasily did not tell her about the blood on the scarf or the many ways it had saved his life. He simply held her and let himself believe, for a moment, that protection could be knitted into wool and that home was something more than a memory. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. Vasily remained in service for another year, helping to train peacetime soldiers and processing out veterans. When he was finally discharged in May of 1946, he returned to Karelia with his sister to rebuild their village. The forests where he had hunted elk as a boy were still there, unchanged by the war that had consumed so much else. Vasily never hunted again. could not bring himself to point a rifle at living things after everything he had seen and done. Instead, he became a teacher, working in the village school, teaching children to read and write and calculate. He kept the scarf, stored carefully in a wooden box with his medals and discharge papers. Sometimes, on very cold mornings, he would take it out and hold it, remembering the frozen ruins of Leningrad and the impossible year when he had become invisible. The official histories of the war would record Vasily Korotayev as one of the successful Soviet snipers who defended Leningrad during the siege. 217 confirmed kills, Order of the Red Star, Hero of the Soviet Union. These facts were true, but incomplete. They failed to capture the reality of what it meant to hunt men through frozen ruins, to kill from hidden positions, to become something less than human in service of survival. The real story was simpler and more complex. A hunter had found a way to hide his breath in the cold. That trick had kept him alive. Everything else was just details. Years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and old secrets became public, military historians studying the siege of Leningrad would discover references in German documents to the Winter Phantom, a Soviet sniper who seemed able to shoot without leaving any trace. German soldiers had reported seeing no muzzle flash, no vapor, no hint of where the shots originated. Some had speculated supernatural causes. Others had assumed it was a team of snipers working in coordination. None had guessed the truth, that it was one man with a scarf, and the patience of a hunter who understood that invisibility was less about hiding than about eliminating every small detail that betrayed presence. The technique Vasily developed would eventually become standard training for cold-weather snipers in armies around the world, though few would know its origin. Military manuals would describe the importance of concealing breath vapor in low-temperature environments, would recommend various methods for dispersing exhaled air. But they would not mention the frozen ruins of Leningrad or the man who had figured it out through necessity and desperation. That knowledge, like so much else about the siege, belonged to those who had lived through it, and they were not inclined to share. Some stories were too hard to tell, some memories too painful to examine in daylight. Vasily lived until 1998, dying quietly in his sleep at the age of 78. His sister found him in the morning, the wooden box open beside his bed, the old scarf clutched in his hands. At his funeral, attended by former students and fellow veterans, several people remarked on the scarf, asking about its significance. His sister told them it had been a gift that had kept him safe during the war. She did not elaborate. The full story, the details of how one man had used a simple piece of wool to become death's invisible messenger, died with Vasily. Perhaps that was appropriate. Ghosts, after all, were not meant to be fully understood. They were meant to be felt, sensed at the edges of perception, acknowledged as presences that had shaped events without ever fully revealing themselves. The scarf was buried with him, wrapped around his hands, still carrying the faint stains that marked its history. In a just world, it would have been displayed in a museum, labeled and explained and preserved as an artifact of wartime innovation. But justice had little to do with how history was recorded. The scarf went into the ground, and with it went the visceral truth of what it had meant to be a sniper in the coldest winter of the bloodiest siege in human history. Some truths could not be preserved. They could only be lived, and then they could only be remembered, and finally, inevitably, they could only be forgotten. But for those few years in the frozen hell of Leningrad, when death came on every wind and survival seemed impossible, one hunter had found a way to breathe without betraying his presence. That simple innovation had saved his life over and over again, had multiplied his effectiveness as a killer, had made him into something the Germans feared but could not fight. The technique would outlast the man. Future snipers in future wars would hide their breath and never know they were following in the footsteps of Vasily Korotayev. That too seemed appropriate. The best hunters left no trace. They simply vanished into the landscape, taking their secrets with them, leaving behind only the silence that followed their passage.